The morning sun filtered through the oak trees lining the street as James Harrington stepped out onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. 15 years in this neighborhood, and he still loved the way the light dappled across his lawn in the early hours. The familiar smell of freshly cut grass hung in the air. He'd mowed yesterday evening, making sure to finish before 7 p.m. as a courtesy to his neighbors. That's just how things worked on Oakwood Lane. Or at least, that's how things used to work. James took a sip of his coffee and frowned at the sight of Patricia Kendall power-walking down the sidewalk, clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. In the 6 months since she'd become HOA president, the peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood had changed. People no longer chatted casually over their fences. Kids played a little quieter. Even the neighborhood's annual barbecue had felt tense under Patricia's watchful eye. "Morning, Patricia," James called out, trying for friendly. Being on good terms with neighbors had always been important to him, especially after losing his wife Beth 3 years ago. The neighborhood had rallied around him then, bringing casseroles and offering company during those darkest days. Patricia barely slowed her pace. "Your garbage can is still at the curb, James. Section 8, paragraph 4 states all receptacles must be removed from street view within 12 hours of collection." She didn't look up from her clipboard as she made a note. "That'll be a warning. Next time it's a $50 fine." The garbage truck had come by at 6 p.m. yesterday. It wasn't even 7 a.m. now. James bit back a retort and nodded instead. "I'll take care of it right away." As Patricia continued her morning patrol, James set down his coffee and wheeled the empty garbage can around to the side of his house. No sense making waves over something so small. But these little incidents had been piling up around the neighborhood. The Thompsons had been cited for having a basketball hoop visible from the street. Old Mr. Wu had received a warning about his bird feeder, attracting nuisance wildlife. The Garcia family's children's chalk drawings on their own driveway had earned them a stern letter about defacement of surfaces visible from common areas. Later that afternoon, James knelt in his backyard, carefully setting the final stones around his new water feature. The small fountain wasn't much, just a simple 3-tier design with water trickling softly from one stone basin to the next. But it meant something to him. Beth had always wanted a water feature in their garden. Something with the sound of running water, she'd say. "It's the most peaceful sound in the world." It had taken him 3 years to finally do it, 3 years to feel ready to fulfill that small wish. The quiet burble of water brought an immediate sense of peace as he plugged it in. James sat back on the grass, listening, allowing himself to feel both the sadness and the healing that came with this small tribute. "Excuse me? What exactly is this?" James startled at the voice behind him. Patricia stood at the edge of his yard, her face pinched with disapproval. "It's just a small fountain," James explained, getting to his feet, "for the garden." "Did you submit a landscape modification request form?" Patricia's pen hovered over her ever-present clipboard. "I didn't think I needed to. It's just a portable fountain, not a permanent structure." Patricia's lips thinned to a tight line. Section 12, paragraph 9 clearly states that any water feature requires board approval. This creates noise pollution and could attract mosquitoes and other pests. I'll have to write this up. Noise pollution? James couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. The gentle trickle was barely audible from where they stood. "Patricia, you can hardly hear it beyond this spot." "Rules are rules, James. You'll need to disconnect it immediately and file the proper paperwork." She was already writing furiously. "The fine for unauthorized installations is $500. $500? For a fountain that's smaller than my microwave? The board takes violations very seriously. If you have concerns, you can bring them up at the next meeting." James knew those meetings well. Since Patricia had taken over, they'd become exercises in frustration, with any opposition quickly silenced by procedural rules that somehow always worked in Patricia's favor. 2 days later, an official notice appeared in James's mailbox. The $500 fine was now official, with a note that continued non-compliance would result in additional daily penalties. James unplugged the fountain but refused to remove it. This had gone beyond a simple rule. This was about Beth, about memory, about having some small control over his own backyard. James tried reason first. He caught Patricia after a board meeting and tried to explain the situation calmly. "It's a memorial of sorts," he said quietly. "For my wife. She always wanted a fountain in the garden." Patricia adjusted her glasses. "While I'm sorry for your loss, rules don't have exceptions for sentimental reasons. That would create a slippery slope." Next, James tried going over her head. He emailed the full HOA board, only to receive automated responses. He later learned that Patricia had convinced the board to funnel all communications through her as a streamlining measure. By the end of the month, the daily penalties had accumulated to $5,000. James's attempts to contest the fine were met with additional charges for administrative review. The next month's total, $15,000. Then $30,000. Then $50,000. It was beyond absurd. More than many people in the neighborhood paid for their cars, for a fountain the size of an end table. But Patricia wasn't backing down. "You've had ample opportunity to comply," she said primly when he confronted her at the mailbox one morning. "The HOA has authorized me to place a lien against your property, if this isn't resolved by the end of the month." A lien against the home he'd shared with Beth, the home where he'd held her hand during those final days, the home filled with 15 years of memories. That evening, James sat on his back porch, staring at the silent fountain. The neighborhood was quiet around him, too quiet, stifled by the weight of Patricia's reign. In the old days, there would have been the sound of kids playing, neighbors grilling, music floating softly from open windows. The community that had once embraced him in his grief now seemed paralyzed by a different kind of fear. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Lena Chen. She was a parent at the school where James taught history, and he remembered her mentioning she practiced real estate law. This had gone far enough. If Patricia wanted to play hardball, he needed someone who understood the rules of the game. "Lena, it's James Harrington. I'm sorry to call so late, but I have a situation with my HOA that's gotten completely out of hand. Do you have time for a consultation?" As he explained the situation, something in James shifted. The sadness and frustration began to crystallize into something else: determination. This wasn't just about the fountain anymore, or even about the ridiculous fine. This was about standing up to a bully who had taken the concept of community and twisted it into something unrecognizable. $50,000? Lena's voice was incredulous. "For a backyard fountain? That can't possibly be enforceable. Let me look into this for you." As James hung up, he gazed out at the darkened backyards of Oakwood Lane. Whatever happened next, he wasn't going down without a fight. Little did Patricia know, she had just pushed the wrong person too far. James sat nervously in the waiting room of Chen Legal Services, his worn leather folder bulging with HOA documents, fine notices, and neighborhood bylaws. The walls were lined with law degrees and professional certificates. A small fish tank bubbled quietly in the corner, reminding him painfully of his silenced fountain. "Mr. Harrington, Lena will see you now," the receptionist said with a smile. James followed her down a short hallway to a modest office where Lena Chen stood to greet him. Her handshake was firm, her expression kind but professional. Unlike the lawyers on TV, her office wasn't intimidating, just practical, with overflowing bookshelves and a desk covered in neatly organized stacks of paper. "Please sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "You mentioned on the phone that you're dealing with an HOA issue?" "That's putting it mildly," James replied, opening his folder. "They're trying to fine me $50,000 for a small backyard fountain, and now they're threatening to put a lien on my house." Lena's eyebrows shot up. $50,000? That can't be right. James pushed the stack of notices across her desk. "It started as a $500 fine for installing without approval. Then they added daily penalties. I've tried talking to them, but the HOA president, Patricia, she won't budge." As Lena flipped through the papers, her frown deepened. "This is unusual, to say the least. These escalating penalties seem excessive for the violation described. She looked up. Did you bring a copy of your HOA covenant agreements and any information about your neighborhood's founding documents? James nodded, pulling more papers from his folder. He'd spent hours the night before digging through his filing cabinet for anything related to the HOA. Good. Let me see those. Lena took the documents and began scanning them quickly, her finger tracing lines of text as she read. Also, do you have the original property documents from when you bought your house? I think so, James said, rummaging deeper in his folder. My wife was always better at keeping track of these things, but I'm pretty sure I have everything. The mention of Beth still brought a tightness to his throat even after 3 years. As Lena continued reading, James stared out her office window. It overlooked a small park where a couple of kids were kicking a soccer ball. One of them fell, got back up laughing, not bothered at all. James wished problems could still be that simple for him. Mr. Harrington, Lena's voice pulled him back. I need to check something. Do you mind if I search the county records database? It might take a few minutes. Of course, James nodded, watching as she turned to her computer and began typing rapidly. The room fell silent except for the clicking of her keyboard and occasional mouse clicks. After about 15 minutes, during which Lena made several notes on a legal pad, she leaned back in her chair with a curious expression. This is interesting, she said finally, turning the screen slightly so James could see. I'm looking at the original plat maps for Oakwood Lane. She pointed to a complicated-looking diagram. According to these records, your street was never properly dedicated to the city. Technically, it's still private property. James leaned forward, squinting at the screen. What does that mean exactly? When most neighborhoods are built, the developer constructs the roads, then officially transfers ownership to the city or county. The streets become public property, maintained by local government. She pointed to another document on her screen, but it looks like in the case of Oakwood Lane, that final step never happened. The road itself is still technically owned by Oakwood Estates Development Corporation. I've never heard of them, James said, confused. Lena clicked through a few more screens. That's because they don't exist anymore, at least not actively. The company appears to have gone bankrupt around 15 years ago, right around when your neighborhood was completed. So who owns the street now? That's the fascinating part, Lena said, an unusual glint in her eye. Technically, the defunct development company still does, but they haven't been paying property taxes on it. According to county records, the road itself is significantly delinquent on tax payments. James shook his head, struggling to follow. I don't understand what this has to do with my fountain or the HOA fine. Lena rolled her chair back from the computer and folded her hands on the desk. Mr. Harrington, when property taxes go unpaid for long enough, the county eventually puts the property up for auction to recoup the missing tax revenue. It's called a tax deed sale. So the county could sell our street? They not only could, they're planning to. I found your street on the list for the next tax auction, which happens to be next month. She tapped a finger thoughtfully on her desk. And here's where things get interesting. If you were to purchase the street at the tax auction, you'd own the very road your HOA is built around. James felt his heart skip a beat as he began to understand. And if I owned the street, the HOA would have no jurisdiction over it, Lena finished for him. More importantly, you'd have certain rights. As the property owner, you could potentially establish access rules since it would be private property. Are you saying I could buy our street? The idea seemed ridiculous, something from a movie, not real life. It's unusual, but not unprecedented, Lena said. There was a case in San Francisco a few years back where residents purchased their street at a tax auction. Different circumstances, but similar principle. How much would something like this cost? James asked, thinking of his teacher's salary and modest savings. Tax auctions start at the amount of back taxes owed, plus penalties and interest. For a street that size. She did some quick calculations on a notepad. Probably around $15,000 to $20,000 depending on the bidding. It was a lot of money, but significantly less than the HOA fine threatening his home. Still, James hesitated. This seems extreme. I just wanted to fight an unfair fine. Lena leaned forward. Mr. Harrington, based on what I'm seeing in these documents, this HOA has been operating beyond its authority in several ways. The fine they've levied against you is almost certainly unenforceable at the amount they're claiming. We could fight directly, but that would be a long, expensive legal battle. She gestured to the documents spread between them. This approach, while unusual, gives you leverage. You wouldn't just be fighting back. You'd be changing the power dynamic entirely. James ran a hand through his hair, still trying to process everything. What exactly would I need to do? First, I'd need to verify all of this with the county assessor's office and do a complete title search. Then we'd need to prepare for the auction. That means having financing in place and understanding exactly what you're bidding on. Lena began writing out a list. If successful, we'd file the new deed, establish clear property boundaries, and then... She looked up with a slight smile. Then we'd inform the HOA of the change in ownership. James tried to imagine Patricia's face when she learned what he'd done. The thought sent a small, guilty thrill through him. This is a lot to take in, he said finally. Of course, you don't need to decide right now. Lena handed him her card. Think it over. This is an unusual approach, but it might be your most effective option, especially given how unreasonable this HOA president seems to be. As James walked to his car, his mind raced with possibilities. The street he'd lived on for 15 years could actually become his property. It seemed impossible, yet Lena had shown him the documents. The legal pathway existed. He paused before getting into his car, looking up and down Oakwood Lane with new eyes. The neat houses, the carefully trimmed lawns, the neighbors who had once been friends before Patricia's reign of petty tyranny. He thought about Beth, how she would have laughed at the audacity of buying an entire street just to make a point. What do you think, Beth? He whispered to himself. Am I crazy to even consider this? The wind rustled through the oak trees lining the street, sending a shower of leaves spiraling down around him. It wasn't an answer, but somehow it felt like permission. James took out his phone and dialed Lena's number. Ms. Chen? It's James Harrington. I've made my decision. Let's do it. Let's buy the street. The county administrative building reminded James of the high school where he taught, all fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, and the faint smell of floor cleaner. He checked his watch again. 9:15 a.m. The tax deed auction was scheduled to begin at 10 p.m., but Lena had insisted they arrive early. Nervous, Lena asked, balancing a cardboard tray with 2 coffee cups. She handed one to James. Terrified, he admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. I've never spent this much money at once in my life, not even on my car. The past 2 months had been a whirlwind of preparation. First came the detailed title search, confirming what Lena had discovered. Oakwood Lane had indeed never been dedicated to the city and remained the property of the now defunct development company. Next was the financial scramble. James had emptied most of his savings and taken a loan against his retirement account to secure the funds they might need, all while trying to keep the plan secret from his neighbors, especially Patricia, who had increased her patrols of the neighborhood and sent 2 more threatening letters about the lien process. James had begun avoiding his own front yard just to minimize the chance of running into her. Remember the plan? Lena said quietly, guiding him toward the auction room. We have a maximum bid amount. If it goes beyond that, we walk away. No emotional bidding. James nodded, though his stomach churned at the thought of coming this far only to lose. What would he do then? The HOA fine still loomed, and Patricia seemed more determined than ever to make an example of him. The auction room was less formal than James had expected. About 30 metal folding chairs faced a small podium with a whiteboard positioned to one side. Most of the chairs were already filled with people drinking coffee and chatting quietly. James scanned the room, worried he might see someone from the neighborhood, but the faces were all unfamiliar. Most of these are professional bidders, Lena whispered as they found seats near the back. They buy tax-delinquent properties to flip, for profit. They're not interested in a street. They want buildable lots or houses they can renovate. James nodded. but couldn't shake the feeling that somehow Patricia would appear, somehow she'd know what he was attempting. The coffee sat uneasily in his stomach. A county official in a gray suit approached the podium, tapped the microphone, and cleared his throat. "Good morning, everyone. We'll begin today's tax deed auction in just a few minutes. Please make sure you've registered and received your bidder number." James patted his pocket where his bidder card, number 37, was safely tucked away. Lena had handled all the registration paperwork, explaining the process to him with remarkable patience. Tax deed auctions, James had learned, were nothing like the fast-talking auctions he'd seen on TV. They were methodical, sometimes painfully slow, as each property was presented, opened for bidding, and sold to the highest bidder. "Remember," Lena murmured, "Oakwood Lane is lot 22 on the list. It'll be a while before they get to it." She was right. The first hour dragged by as various vacant lots and abandoned properties were auctioned off. Some sparked bidding wars that drove prices well above the initial tax debt. Others received no bids at all and reverted to county ownership. James tried to focus, to understand the rhythm of the auction, but his mind kept drifting to what would happen if, when, he actually owned his street. Lot 22. The auctioneer finally announced. Oakwood Lane Roadway, Oakwood Estates Subdivision. Approximately 0.8 acres. Linear property classified as private roadway. Delinquent taxes and fees. Total $17,042.33. Opening bid starts at this amount. Do I have any bidders? The room fell quiet. James hesitated, his hand halfway raised, suddenly frozen with doubt. Lena nudged him. "Now," she whispered. "Bidder 37. James called out, his voice cracking slightly. $17,842.33. The auctioneer nodded, making a note on his clipboard. "We have $17,842.33 from bidder 37. Do I hear 18,000? James held his breath, scanning the room. No hands went up. The professional bidders showed no interest in a property they couldn't build on or sell easily. Going once for $17,842.33, the auctioneer called. Going twice? 18,000, called a voice from the front row. James's heart sank. He craned his neck to see who had bid against him, an older man in a suit who hadn't bid on anything else so far. We have 18,000 from bidder 12, the auctioneer noted. Do I hear 18,500? Lena squeezed James's arm reassuringly. Stay calm. Stick to the plan. 18,500, James called out, his voice steadier this time. 19,000. The mystery bidder countered immediately. And so it went, back and forth, the price climbing in $500 increments. By 23,000, James was sweating. They were approaching his maximum budget, and the other bidder showed no signs of backing down. 25,000. The other bidder called after James's last offer of 24,500. James turned to Lena, panic rising. They had agreed on a maximum of 25,000. One more bid would put him over budget, stretching his finances beyond what he could reasonably manage. Your call, Lena whispered. We're at your limit. James stared at the back of his opponents, head wondering who this person was and why they wanted a random street in a suburban neighborhood. Could Patricia somehow have found out? Could she have sent someone to outbid him? The thought of coming this close only to fail was unbearable. 25,500, James called out, his heart pounding. Lena gave him a sharp look, but said nothing. The auctioneer turned to the front row. Bidder 12. Do I hear 26,000? The mystery man seemed to hesitate, then slowly shook his head. 25,500 going once, going twice. Sold to bidder 37 for $25,500. James couldn't breathe. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He'd just bought his own street. The rest of the auction passed in a blur. After the final property was sold, Lena guided him to a processing area where he signed paperwork and handed over a cashier's check. 3 hours later, he walked out of the county building clutching a folder containing the deed to Oakwood Lane. I can't believe it worked, he said as they stood in the parking lot. I actually own the street now. Congratulations, Mr. Harrington. You're now a road owner. Lena smiled. The deed will be officially recorded within 10 business days. After that, we can move to Phase 2. Phase 2. They had discussed it thoroughly, what James could legally do as the owner of a private road. His rights, his responsibilities, and most importantly, how this would affect his relationship with the HOA that had made his life miserable. Do you think that other bidder was connected to Patricia somehow? James asked, as they walked to their cars. Doubtful, Lena replied. More likely a speculator hoping to buy it cheap and then sell it to the homeowners association for a profit. That's a common tactic. The next week was the hardest, waiting for the deed to be officially recorded. While trying to act normal around the neighborhood, Patricia left another notice on his door, this one stating that the HOA board would be voting on foreclosure proceedings at their next meeting. James tucked it away in his growing file of HOA harassment, his worry now mixed with a strange sense of anticipation. Finally, the email arrived from the county recorder's office. The deed had been processed. Oakwood Lane officially belonged to James Harrington, or more precisely, to Harrington Holdings, LLC, the company Lena had helped him establish to own the property and limit his personal liability. That evening, James invited Lena over to finalize their next steps. They sat at his kitchen table surrounded by papers, signs, and legal documents. Is all this really necessary? James asked, looking at the stack of official-looking notices they had prepared. If you want it to be legally enforceable, yes, Lena replied. A private road owner has rights, but you need to properly establish and assert them. They worked late into the night, going over every detail of the plan. When Lena finally left, James stood in his driveway looking at the street. His street, with a mix of disbelief and determination. Early the next morning, before most of his neighbors were awake, James got to work. At each end of Oakwood Lane, he installed tasteful but unmistakable signs. Private road, property of Harrington Holdings, LLC. Smaller signs beneath stated, access rules in effect. See owner for details. By 7:30 a.m., he had finished setting up a small table and chair near the entrance to the street, with a stack of official-looking forms and a cash box. Then he waited, coffee thermos at his side, heart pounding with nervous energy. He didn't have to wait long. At precisely 8:15 a.m., Patricia's silver sedan approached the entrance to the street, returning from her regular morning workout at the community center gym. James straightened his tie as her car slowed, her expression changing from confusion to shock as she read the new signs. She rolled down her window. What is the meaning of this, James? Remove these signs immediately. This is a clear violation of HOA regulations. James stood, clipboard in hand, and approached her car with what he hoped was a pleasant, professional smile. Good morning, Patricia, he said calmly. I wanted to personally inform you of some recent changes. As the new legal owner of Oakwood Lane, I've established a toll system for non-residents. Since your property doesn't actually border this private road, your driveway connects through the cul-de-sac on Maple Court. You'll need either a daily access pass or an annual membership to use this roadway. He extended a document toward her. Here's the official fee schedule. It's $25 per day for casual use or a $10,000 annual pass for regular access. Which would you prefer today? The color drained from Patricia's face, then returned in a flood of angry red. For perhaps the first time since James had known her, Patricia Kendall was completely speechless. News traveled fast in Oakwood Estates. By noon, James's phone was buzzing nonstop with text messages and calls from neighbors. He'd expected anger, maybe even threats of legal action. What he hadn't expected was the first message from Bill Thompson. Is it true? Did you actually buy the street? That's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. After Patricia had sped away that morning, parking her car at the community center and storming home on foot rather than paying the toll, James had removed his little table from the entrance. He needed time to think, to prepare for the neighborhood fallout. He'd known his actions would cause a stir, but he hadn't fully considered how his neighbors would react. Now, sitting in his kitchen watching his phone light up with notifications, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. These were people he'd lived alongside for years. What if they all turned against him? The doorbell rang, startling him. When he opened the door, he found Joe Garcia standing on his porch, six-pack of beer in hand. "Hey," Joe said, offering the beer. "Thought you might need this today." James accepted the beer with confusion. "You're not mad?" Joe laughed. "Mad? Patricia's been making my family miserable for months. She fined us when my kids drew hopscotch squares on our own driveway. Said it was unauthorized artistic expression visible from common areas. The kids were heartbroken." He shook his head. Nobody's had the guts to stand up to her until now. James invited Joe in, and they sat at the kitchen table, each opening a beer. "So what happens now?" Joe asked after taking a sip. "We all have to pay to drive to our own homes?" "No, of course not," James assured him quickly. "I never intended to charge my neighbors. This was only ever about stopping Patricia's abuse of power." "Well, word's spreading fast," Joe said, checking his phone. "There's talk about an emergency neighborhood meeting tonight. Patricia called it. At the community center, of course, not on your street." He grinned. "She's furious." "I'm not surprised," James sighed. "I should probably prepare for that." After Joe left, promising to spread the word that James wasn't planning to charge his neighbors, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was Elaine, Wu, whose bird feeder had earned her a citation from Patricia. "I baked you cookies," she said, holding out a plate of chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven. "My grandson says you're like Robin Hood now." Throughout the afternoon, a steady stream of neighbors stopped by. Some brought food, others just wanted to hear the story firsthand. Most shared their own tales of Patricia's reign of terror, ridiculous fines, petty enforcement of obscure rules, the gradual erosion of the neighborhood's once friendly atmosphere. By 5 o'clock, James's kitchen counter was covered with casseroles, cookies, and bottles of wine. His recycling bin overflowed with beer bottles. The initial anxiety had given way to a cautious optimism. Maybe his neighbors understood after all. Lena called around 6. "How are you holding up?" "Better than expected," James told her. "Turns out I'm not the only one Patricia's been tormenting, but there's an emergency neighborhood meeting tonight. I should probably attend." "Definitely," Lena agreed. "But remember, you're in a position of strength now. Patricia has no authority over your property, and legally speaking, she can't prevent you from attending the meeting even though she'll try. What if they vote to take legal action against me?" "They can try," Lena said confidently. "But I've reviewed their bylaws thoroughly. The HOA has no easement or right-of-way agreement for the street. They've been operating for years under a mistaken assumption that the street was public property. Any judge would laugh their case out of court." James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thanks, Lena, I couldn't have done this without you." "Just doing my job," she replied. "Though I have to admit, this is the most interesting case I've had in years. Let me know how the meeting goes." The community center was packed when James arrived at 7:30. Neighbors crammed into folding chairs with more standing along the walls. The usual turnout for HOA meetings was maybe a dozen people. Tonight, it looked like almost every household was represented. James slipped in quietly, taking a spot against the back wall. He nodded to a few neighbors who caught his eye, receiving thumbs-up gestures and encouraging smiles in return. The support bolstered his courage. Patricia stood at the front of the room, her face tight with anger. Beside her sat the other HOA board members, looking uncomfortable. One of them, the treasurer, Robert Johnson, kept checking his watch as if wishing he were anywhere else. "I call this emergency meeting to order," Patricia announced, rapping a gavel sharply against the podium. "As you may have heard, we have a crisis situation in our community. One of our residents has taken an action that threatens the very foundation of our neighborhood governance." She paused, scanning the room until her gaze landed on James. "Mr. Harrington has somehow acquired ownership of Oakwood Lane and is now attempting to restrict access to our own homes by establishing an illegal toll road." Murmurs swept through the crowd. James remained silent, waiting. "This is a clear violation of our HOA covenants," Patricia continued. Section 3, Paragraph 2. clearly states that no resident may obstruct or impede access to community areas. I have already consulted with an attorney, and we will be filing an injunction first thing tomorrow morning to have these ridiculous signs removed and restore proper order to our neighborhood. James felt a moment of doubt. Had he overlooked something in the bylaws? He'd read them carefully, but legal language could be tricky. Patricia was still talking. Furthermore, Mr. Harrington remains in violation of several other HOA regulations, including the unauthorized water feature that started this whole unfortunate situation. The accumulated fines now exceed $50,000, and I'm afraid we have no choice but to proceed with placing a lien on his property. A hand shot up from the middle of the room. It was Debbie Parker, a retired elementary school principal who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. Yes, Debbie? Patricia acknowledged her with obvious reluctance. I have a question, Debbie said, rising to her feet. If James owns the street, how exactly does the HOA have authority over it? My understanding is that HOA jurisdiction only extends to properties covered by the covenant agreements. Patricia's mouth tightened. The road is part of our community infrastructure. The HOA has always maintained it. Actually, another voice interrupted. It was Tom Lee, who worked for the city's Public Works Department. The HOA has never maintained that road. I checked our records today. The city has been plowing it in winter and repairing potholes even though it wasn't officially city property. There was a mix-up in the records years ago. More murmurs, louder this time. Patricia rapped her gavel again. The point is, this vigilante action by Mr. Harrington is disrupting our community. He's holding us all hostage over a simple rule enforcement issue. She fixed James with a cold stare. If he had simply complied with the regulations we all agreed to when we purchased our homes, none of this would be happening. James decided it was time to speak up. He stepped forward, feeling every eye in the room turn to him. I didn't come here to fight, he began. I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years. I've always kept my property in good condition, been a good neighbor, and followed reasonable rules. But what's been happening recently isn't reasonable. He took a deep breath. The water feature in my backyard was something my late wife always wanted. When I finally installed it, a small, quiet fountain that you can barely hear beyond my own yard, I was hit with a fine that kept growing until it threatened my home. Most of you know me. Does that sound fair? Heads shook throughout the room. Patricia tried to interrupt, but several voices called for James to continue. I didn't buy the street to cause problems, James continued. I did it because it was the only way to protect myself from what was happening. And now that I own it, I want to be clear about something. I have no intention of charging any resident of this neighborhood for access. The toll only applies to one person. He looked directly at Patricia. The person who tried to take my home over a garden fountain. The room erupted in applause and laughter. Patricia banged her gavel furiously, her face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. The board will not stand for this kind of... I move to hold an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA president, called a voice from the side of the room. It was Robert Johnson, the HOA treasurer, standing now with a determined expression. And I move that we immediately rescind all fines against Mr. Harrington as they were issued without proper board approval. Patricia looked stunned. Robert, you can't possibly... I second the motion, Debbie Parker said firmly. All in favor? Robert asked the room. A forest of hands shot up. James watched in amazement as nearly every person in the room raised their hand, including the remaining board members seated at the front table. Only Patricia and a couple of her closest friends kept their hands down. Motion carries, Robert announced. Patricia, I believe that concludes your term as HOA president, effective immediately. As treasurer, I will serve as interim president until we can hold a proper election. Patricia grabbed her purse and stormed toward the exit, pausing, only briefly beside James. This isn't over, she hissed before pushing past him. As the meeting continued, with Robert leading a more calm discussion about next steps, James felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Bill Thompson. So, Bill whispered, about those lifetime access passes you mentioned to Joe Garcia. Any chance the rest of us could get in on that deal? James smiled. $1 each. I'll be in my driveway tomorrow morning with the paperwork." By the time the meeting ended, James had been invited to 3 different neighborhood barbecues planned for the weekend. Walking home under the streetlights, he felt a sense of community he hadn't experienced since before Beth died. Since before, Patricia had turned to neighbor against neighbor with her clipboard and rulebook. As he passed the private road sign at the entrance to Oakwood Lane, he couldn't help but smile. Sometimes standing up for yourself meant standing up for everyone. For the next 2 weeks, Patricia remained stubbornly defiant. Each morning, she parked her car at the community center and walked the quarter-mile to her house, chin held high, refusing to make eye contact with anyone she passed. She carried her groceries the same way, making multiple trips rather than paying James's toll or asking for one of the lifetime passes that every other neighbor now proudly displayed on their cars. James kept the toll booth set up, though he only manned it, when he knew Patricia might be coming through. He felt a little guilty about the pettiness of it all, but after months of her harassment, the small satisfaction of watching her trudge past with her arms full of shopping bags helped ease the sting of the battle she'd put him through. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had undergone a remarkable transformation. With Robert Johnson serving as interim HOA president, the atmosphere of fear and suspicion had lifted. Children played outside again. Neighbors chatted across fences. The Garcia kids' hopscotch squares reappeared on their driveway, along with an elaborate chalk mural that spilled onto the sidewalk, something that would have earned them multiple citations under Patricia's regime. One sunny Saturday morning, James was tending to his garden when Lena's car pulled up in front of his house. She stepped out carrying a thick folder. "Good news," she said as she approached. "The county recorder's office confirmed everything. Your ownership of the street is rock solid. I've brought all the final documentation for you to keep." "Thanks," James said, taking the folder. "Though I'm starting to wonder what I'm going to do with the street. Maintaining it will get expensive eventually." Lena sat on the garden bench beside his flower beds. "Have you considered donating it to the city? They could incorporate it properly this time. You'd be free of the responsibility and it would become public property." James considered this. "Maybe. But what if the HOA goes back to its old ways? I'd lose my leverage." "Fair point," Lena conceded. "Although from what you've told me, the neighborhood seems to be turning a corner. That emergency meeting vote was pretty decisive." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. James looked up to see Robert Johnson and a woman he recognized as Amy Fletcher, a retired judge who'd lived at the far end of the street for years. "Morning, James," Robert called. "Got a minute to talk? We've had some developments at the HOA I think you'll want to hear about." James invited them all inside. They gathered around his kitchen table where Robert spread out some papers. "We held an official election yesterday," Robert explained. "Amy here is our new president." "Congratulations," James said, offering her a handshake. "Thank you," Amy replied, with a warm smile. "My first order of business was to review all the fines issued during Patricia's presidency. The board voted unanimously to cancel yours and several others that were clearly excessive." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. "That's great news. Thank you." "There's more," Robert continued. "We've completely revised the bylaws. Amy's legal background was invaluable. We've added checks and balances to prevent any future president from abusing their authority. No fine over $100 can be issued without a hearing and majority board vote. And we've clarified the approval process for home improvements to be much more reasonable." Amy handed James a document. "This is the new streamlined application for your water feature. It's pre-approved. Just needs your signature for the records." James looked at the paper, then back at Amy and Robert, momentarily speechless. "We also wanted to discuss the street situation," Amy said. "The board recognizes your legal ownership of Oakwood Lane, but we're hoping to find a solution that works for everyone long-term." "I've actually been thinking about that," James admitted. "I never wanted to own a street. I just wanted to stop what was happening with the HOA." "We understand," Amy nodded. "And we're committed to making sure those kinds of abuses never happen again. We're wondering if you'd consider transferring ownership of the street to a neighborhood trust. Everyone who lives here, would be a stakeholder. Decisions about maintenance and access would be made by consensus, not by the HOA board alone. James looked at Lena. Is that legally possible? It's unusual but doable, she confirmed. The trust could be structured with strong protections to prevent any future power grabs. The conversation continued for another hour, working through details and possibilities. By the time Robert and Amy left, they had the framework of an agreement that would return the street to community ownership while protecting everyone's interests. As James walked them to the door, he noticed Patricia standing by her mailbox across the street. She quickly turned away when she saw them looking. She put her house on the market yesterday, Amy said quietly. Priced to sell quickly. I didn't know, James said, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. He'd never wanted to drive her away. He'd just wanted fair treatment. Later that evening, as James sat on his back porch listening to the gentle sound of his fountain, he heard the gate latch click. Turning, he was shocked to see Patricia standing awkwardly at the edge of his yard. Can I come in? She asked, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. James nodded, gesturing to the chair opposite his. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the burbling water the only sound between them. I'm moving to Arizona, Patricia finally said. My sister lives there. The sale should be final next week. I heard the house was on the market, James replied, unsure what else to say. Patricia stared at the fountain, her expression unreadable. It's quieter than I expected, the water feature. James nodded. That's what I tried to tell you. Another long silence stretched between them. Finally, Patricia sighed. I'm not good at this, she said. Admitting when I'm wrong. My husband used to say it was my worst quality. She straightened her shoulders. The rules were important to me, structure, order. I thought I was making the neighborhood better. I didn't see how I was making everyone miserable. Including yourself, James observed. Patricia gave a short, humorless laugh. Especially myself. Do you know how exhausting it is to patrol for violations every day? To keep track of every infraction? I couldn't even enjoy my own home anymore. She stood, smoothing her slacks. Anyway, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to say, you weren't wrong to fight back. I would have taken your house if I could have. And She seemed to struggle with the word. Sorry for that. Before James could respond, she turned and walked briskly toward the gate. She paused there, looking back at the fountain one last time. It's nice, she said simply, and then she was gone. A week later, Patricia's house sold to a young family with 2 small children. The street ownership was transferred to the Oakwood Lane Community Trust, with every household a voting member. James removed the toll signs, keeping just one as a souvenir. That summer, the neighborhood held its first block party in years. Tables lined the street, their street, covered with potluck dishes and drinks. Children ran laughing between houses, and James's backyard, with its gentle fountain, became a natural gathering place as evening fell. Sitting there among his neighbors, watching the sun set over the homes they'd all fought to make truly theirs again, James raised his glass in a silent toast to Beth. She would have loved this. Not just the fountain, but the community they'd created together.